The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I stood in the middle of the trading floor, my hands trembling while clutching a stack of quarterly reports that had taken me 3 sleepless nights to compile. Marcus Thornhill, the regional director with his perfectly pressed Armani suit and that condescending smirk I'd come to despise over the past 18 months, circled around me like a shark that had just detected blood in the water. Everyone in the office had stopped what they were doing, their fingers frozen over keyboards, phones pressed against ears in suspended conversations, all eyes locked on the spectacle that was about to unfold. I could feel my face burning with a mixture of embarrassment and rage as Marcus cleared his throat theatrically, ensuring he had the attention of every single person in the room before he began his performance. This wasn't just going to be a termination, this was going to be a public execution designed to humiliate me in front of my colleagues, most of whom I'd shared coffee breaks with, complained about deadlines with, and even celebrated birthdays with in the cramped break room that always smelled faintly of burnt popcorn and disappointment. Marcus had never liked me from the moment. I'd walked through those glass doors on my first day, my cheap department store suit hanging awkwardly on my frame, my resume boasting a state university degree rather than an Ivy League pedigree like his. He'd made it his personal mission to undermine every project I touched, to question every decision I made in meetings, to CC half the company on emails pointing out minor mistakes that anyone could have made. But I'd endured it all because I needed this job desperately, because my mother's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves, because my younger sister's college tuition was due next semester, and because despite everything, I was actually good at what I did when given half a chance. The reports I was holding were proof of that. Detailed analysis that had identified a critical inefficiency in our supply chain that could save the company millions annually. But Marcus hadn't even bothered to read past the first page before summoning me to the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his voice dripping with theatrical disdain as he gestured toward me like I was an exhibit in a museum of failures. "I want everyone to witness what happens when mediocrity meets corporate standards." The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen to maximize damage. David Harrison here thought he could bypass proper channels, thought he could question decisions made by people with decades more experience than his pathetic year-and-a-half tenure. He paused for effect, letting his words sink in while several people shifted uncomfortably in their ergonomic chairs. I wanted to defend myself, to tell everyone that I'd simply followed the protocol outlined in the employee handbook, that I'd submitted my findings through the proper channels before bringing them to his attention, but my throat had closed up and my tongue felt like sandpaper against the roof of my mouth. Marcus continued his tirade, pacing back and forth while occasionally stopping to straighten his tie or check his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city skyline, a reminder of everything I was about to lose. "This report," he said, snatching the documents from my hands with such force that several pages fluttered to the ground like wounded birds, "is a perfect example of amateur hour analysis based on incomplete data and misguided assumptions." He didn't elaborate on what was supposedly wrong with it because he couldn't, because he hadn't actually read it thoroughly enough to critique its contents. But that didn't matter to him, because this wasn't about the quality of my work. This was about power and control and putting someone he deemed beneath him in their place. The irony was almost laughable, because somewhere in my chest cavity where my heart was supposed to be beating normally, there was instead a cold, hardening resolve forming like ice crystals in winter. What Marcus Thornhill didn't know, what nobody in that office knew except for me and the woman in HR who'd processed my paperwork with unusual discretion 18 months ago, was that my full name wasn't just David Harrison. It was David Harrison Caldwell, and I'd deliberately dropped my mother's maiden name from all my professional documents when I'd applied for this position because I'd wanted to make it on my own merits, without the shadow of my family's reputation influencing how people treated me. My mother, Catherine Caldwell, had built Caldwell Industries from the ground up over 30 years, transforming it from a small logistics company into a multinational conglomerate with holdings across 17 countries. And she'd recently made the decision to acquire Thornhill's company, Apex Trading Solutions, as part of her expansion strategy into emerging markets. The acquisition had been finalized exactly 2 weeks ago, though the internal restructuring and announcement of new leadership wouldn't happen for another 72 hours according to the timeline my mother's transition team had outlined. I stood there absorbing Marcus's venomous words while my mind raced through calculations and possibilities, weighing the satisfaction of revealing my identity right now against the strategic advantage of waiting just 3 more days until the official announcement would turn his world upside down. His voice had risen to a crescendo now, spittle forming at the corners of his mouth as he worked himself into a frenzy of righteous indignation, telling everyone assembled how I represented everything wrong with entitled millennials who thought showing up and doing the bare minimum entitled them to recognition and advancement. The accusations were so absurdly disconnected from reality that under different circumstances I might have laughed, because I'd consistently been the first person in the office every morning and the last to leave every evening, because I'd volunteered for projects nobody else wanted, because I'd taken on extra responsibilities without demanding additional compensation, all while dealing with personal challenges that would have broken lesser people. But Marcus knew nothing about my life outside these walls, knew nothing about the nights I'd spent in hospital waiting rooms while my mother underwent chemotherapy treatments, knew nothing about the scholarships I'd researched for my sister, because our father had abandoned us when I was 12 and left us with nothing but debt and broken promises. Effective immediately, Marcus declared with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, "Your employment with Apex Trading Solutions is terminated." He snapped his fingers at Jennifer from HR, a nervous woman in her 50s who'd always been kind to me, who looked absolutely mortified as she approached with a cardboard box and a manila envelope containing what I assumed were my termination papers. "You have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings and surrender your access badge, and security will escort you from the premises to ensure you don't attempt to steal any proprietary information on your way out." The implication that I was not only incompetent but also potentially criminal was the final insult, the cherry on top of this humiliation sundae he'd been serving up with such relish. Around the room, I could see reactions ranging from shocked sympathy to barely concealed schadenfreude, because office politics turned decent people into spectators at a gladiatorial arena, content to watch someone else's career get destroyed as long as it meant their own position remained secure. Something inside me finally snapped, not into anger or desperation, but into an eerie calm that settled over me like a blanket of fresh snow, cold and pure and clarifying. I looked Marcus Thornhill directly in his self-satisfied eyes, those pale blue eyes that had never seen me as a person, but only as an obstacle, or a stepping stone, or a convenient target for his insecurities. And I smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile or a defeated smile. It was the kind of smile that made his expression falter for just a fraction of a second, uncertainty flickering across his features before he reasserted his mask of superiority. "Thank you, Marcus," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, "for making this decision so much easier." He looked confused, his brow furrowing as he tried to parse whether I was being sarcastic or sincere. But I didn't elaborate because there was no point in showing my hand when the game was already won, when the clock was already counting down to his inevitable reckoning. I took the cardboard box from Jennifer with a gentle nod of gratitude, noting the apologetic squeeze she gave my shoulder when Marcus's attention was briefly diverted by his phone, buzzing with what I assumed was another message from someone inflating his already oversized ego. My desk was in the corner by the window, a location I'd actually requested because I liked watching the sunrise during those early morning hours when the office was still empty and peaceful, when I could think without interruption and plan without interference. There wasn't much to pack because I'd never been the type to personalize my workspace with photos or knickknacks or motivational posters. Just a coffee mug my sister had given me with "World's Okayest Brother" printed on it, a small succulent plant that had somehow survived my inconsistent watering schedule, and a leather portfolio containing notes and ideas I'd been developing for a presentation I'd foolishly thought I might get to deliver someday. The computer contained 18 months of work, analysis and reports and emails that documented not just my contributions, but also a pattern of Marcus's interference and sabotage that I'd been meticulously cataloging without really knowing why. some instinct telling me that documentation might prove valuable someday. Marcus had returned to his office, apparently satisfied that the show was over, and his authority had been sufficiently demonstrated, leaving me to my packing while security guard Tom approached with obvious reluctance. Tom was a retired cop in his 60s who worked nights and weekends to supplement his pension, who'd often chatted with me about his grandchildren during my late-night work sessions, and the shame in his eyes as he prepared to escort me out was almost harder to bear than Marcus's cruelty. "I'm sorry about this, David," he muttered under his breath as I placed the last of my belongings in the box. "That was completely uncalled for, and everyone knows it." I appreciated the solidarity even though it changed nothing about my immediate situation. Even though come Monday morning, Tom would still have a job here, and I would be officially unemployed for the first time since I was 16 years old and started bussing tables at a diner to help make ends meet. The walk from my desk to the elevator felt simultaneously endless and far too short, every step measured and deliberate while dozens of eyes tracked my progress. Some sympathetic, some curious, some already calculating how my sudden departure might create opportunities for their own advancement. The elevator doors closed with a soft pneumatic hiss, sealing me away from the whispers and stares that had followed me across the trading floor like shadows. And for the first time in nearly 2 hours, I allowed myself to exhale fully, my shoulders sagging under the weight of everything that had just transpired. Tom stood beside me in uncomfortable silence, occasionally glancing at me as if trying to decide whether to offer more condolences or just let the moment pass. And I appreciated his restraint because I wasn't sure I could handle much more sympathy without the dam breaking completely. The elevator descended through 43 floors of steel and glass and corporate ambition, each number lighting up and fading on the display panel marking my journey from employed professional to unemployed statistic. And I found myself thinking about all the mornings I'd ridden this same elevator upward with hope and determination, believing that hard work and integrity would eventually be rewarded in some meaningful way. How naive I'd been. How stupidly optimistic to think that merit mattered more than politics. That results spoke louder than connections. That doing the right thing would somehow protect you from people who measured success by how many subordinates they could crush beneath their Italian leather shoes. The lobby was bustling with the usual lunch hour crowd, executives and assistants and delivery people weaving through the marble expanse beneath that ridiculously expensive chandelier that probably cost more than my annual salary. And I was grateful for the anonymity the crowd provided as Tom walked me to the security desk, where I surrendered my badge and signed some papers I didn't bother reading because what was the point? My phone buzzed in my pocket as I pushed through the revolving doors into the unseasonably warm October afternoon, and I pulled it out to see a text from my sister Emma asking how my big presentation had gone. The presentation I'd been preparing for weeks that Marcus had canceled yesterday without explanation, claiming budget constraints required postponing all non-essential meetings. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth right now. Couldn't shatter her faith in the just world hypothesis she still somehow maintained despite everything our family had endured. So I simply replied that it had been postponed and I'd explain later. A lie of omission that tasted bitter on my conscience, but felt necessary in the moment. I walked without direction for several blocks, the cardboard box growing heavier with each step despite its meager contents, passing coffee shops and boutiques, and the lives of people who weren't currently experiencing the complete disintegration of their professional identity. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was my mother, her contact photo showing her laughing at some charity gala from before the cancer diagnosis. Before the treatments had stolen her hair and 30 pounds and temporarily dimmed that fierce light that had always burned in her eyes. "Sweetheart," her voicemail began, because I'd been too caught up in my own spiral to answer. "I know you said you wanted to handle everything on your own terms, and I've respected that boundary. But the transition team just sent me the organizational charts for Apex and I saw his name, saw Marcus Thornhill listed as regional director. And darling, I need you to tell me he hasn't been making your life miserable, because if he has, then we need to talk about accelerating the timeline." Her voice carried that particular tone that meant she was trying to stay calm while internally preparing to destroy someone. That CEO voice that had made grown men in boardrooms reconsider their negotiating positions, and I felt a wave of love and guilt wash over me because she had enough to worry about with her health without adding my employment drama to her plate. I found myself standing outside a small park. I'd passed countless times but never actually entered. One of those urban green spaces that somehow survived the relentless development pressure. And I sat down on a bench still warm from the afternoon sun, setting my box beside me while I tried to organize my thoughts into something resembling a coherent plan. The rational part of my brain understood that this was temporary, that in 72 hours when Caldwell Industries officially announced the acquisition and the new leadership structure, Marcus would discover that the junior analyst he'd just humiliated and fired was actually the son of his new owner, and that his own position would become untenable regardless of whatever protections his employment contract might theoretically provide. But the emotional part of my brain was still reeling from the public nature of the humiliation. From having my competence and character assassinated in front of colleagues, from the casual cruelty of someone who wielded power without wisdom or compassion. I'd known people like Marcus existed, had encountered them before in various contexts, but I'd never been the direct target of such sustained vindictiveness. Had never experienced what it felt like to have someone actively working to undermine and destroy you simply because your existence somehow threatened their fragile ego. My phone rang. Again, and this time it was Richard Chen, my mother's chief operating officer and the man who'd been managing the Apex acquisition from the Caldwell Industries side, someone I'd known since childhood when he was just starting out as my mother's assistant, and I was a kid who spent afternoons in her office doing homework while she worked late. "David," he said without preamble when I answered, "I just got off the phone with your mother, and she's about 5 minutes away from calling an emergency board meeting to accelerate the transition announcement, so I need you to tell me right now what happened and whether we need to move up our timeline." I could hear the concern in his voice mixed with the calculation of a man who'd spent decades navigating corporate politics, weighing personal loyalty against strategic considerations, and I appreciated that he was giving me agency in this decision rather than just making it for me. I took a deep breath and told him everything. The reports Marcus had dismissed without reading, the public termination designed for maximum humiliation, the accusations of incompetence and potential theft. And with each detail I shared, I could hear Richard's breathing getting shorter and sharper until he finally interrupted me with a string of profanity creative enough to make a longshoreman blush. "That arrogant bastard," Richard muttered, and I could hear him typing furiously on his keyboard, probably pulling up files and organizational charts and employment contracts while we spoke, his legendary multitasking abilities on full display even during a crisis. "David, I need you to listen to me very carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is going to sound like I'm prioritizing business over your feelings, but I promise you there's a method to this madness." He paused and I could picture him in his corner office downtown, probably pacing in front of those floor-to-ceiling windows he'd had installed specifically because they helped him think. His salt and pepper hair slightly disheveled from running his hands through it the way he always did when strategizing. "We have documentation of everything. Every email you've sent through company servers, every report you've filed, every piece of analysis you've produced, because part of our due diligence process included monitoring key personnel to identify talent worth retaining post-acquisition, and you've been flagged as someone with exceptional potential since month 3 of your employment there." The revelation that I'd been under observation, even benevolent observation, felt strange and slightly invasive. But I understood the business rationale behind it. Understood that acquisitions weren't just about assets and market share but about human capital and institutional knowledge. Richard continued laying out the situation with the precision of a chess grandmaster explaining a complex endgame strategy, his words coming faster now as he worked through scenarios and contingencies in real time. "Marcus Thornhill is already on our termination list. Not because of any personal vendetta, but because our analysis of Apex's management structure identified him as a significant liability, someone whose leadership style has contributed to higher than average turnover in his division and missed opportunities that cost the company substantial revenue over the past 3 years. He pulled up specific numbers, rattling off percentages and dollar amounts that painted a picture of systemic dysfunction. masked by Marcus's ability to manage upward while grinding down everyone below him, a common enough pattern in corporate America, but one that rarely survived the scrutiny of an acquisition. The quarterly reports you compiled, the ones he dismissed today, actually align almost perfectly with findings from our external audit team, which means you independently identified the same supply chain inefficiencies that consultants charging $5,000 an hour found using completely different methodology. And that kind of analytical capability is exactly what we need in the new organizational structure. The validation should have felt good, but mostly it just felt exhausting. Confirmation that I'd been right all along, but that being right hadn't protected me from someone determined to maintain their petty fiefdom. "Here's what's going to happen," Richard said, shifting from analysis mode into action mode, his voice taking on that authoritative quality that made people instinctively trust his judgment. "You're going to take the weekend to decompress and spend time with your family, and Monday morning at 9 a.m. sharp, you're going to walk into the Caldwell Industries headquarters, downtown, where you'll meet with me and the transition team to discuss your role in the new organizational structure." He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "We're moving the public announcement up to Monday afternoon, earlier than planned, and part of that announcement will include the new leadership appointments for the Apex division, which will make it very clear to everyone, including Marcus, exactly where they stand in the new hierarchy." I could hear the satisfaction in his voice, the particular pleasure of someone who'd spent decades fighting corporate battles and knew exactly how to deploy information for maximum impact. "Your official title will be Vice President of Strategic Operations for the Integrated Division, reporting directly to me, and while I know that nepotism concerns have always bothered you, I need you to understand that this position isn't being created for you. It already existed in our restructuring plans, and you're getting it because you're the most qualified candidate we've identified, which the documentation will clearly support if anyone questions it." The magnitude of what Richard was describing started to penetrate through the fog of emotional exhaustion that had settled over me. Like a heavy blanket, the realization that my career wasn't ending, but rather undergoing a dramatic transformation that would leapfrog me several levels beyond where I'd been this morning when I was still just a junior analyst, hoping for a promotion to senior analyst sometime in the next year or two. "I don't want revenge," I said quietly, surprising myself with the truth of it. Because somewhere during this conversation, the anger had transmuted into something else. Something closer to pity for Marcus and others like him who measured their worth by their ability to diminish others. I just want to do good work and build something meaningful and maybe prevent other people from experiencing what I went through today. Richard made a sound that was half laugh and half sigh, the sound of someone who'd heard similar sentiments from idealistic young executives before and knew both their value and their limitations. "David, what you want and what's going to happen aren't mutually exclusive. And frankly, the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation. It's building something so successful and so obviously valuable that it becomes impossible for small-minded people to diminish your contributions." He was right, of course. Had always been right about these things, which was why my mother had trusted him as her second-in-command for over 15 years. We talked for another 20 minutes about logistics and timelines, about the transition process and the inevitable awkwardness of returning to Apex, not as a fired employee, but as part of the new executive leadership. And Richard promised to handle the communication strategy in a way that would be professional, but unmistakably clear about what had transpired and why changes were being implemented. "One more thing," he added just before we hung up, his voice softening slightly. "Your mother is incredibly proud of you, not just for your work performance but for your integrity, for insisting on making your own way even when it would have been easier to trade on the family name. And she wanted me to tell you that because apparently you've been dodging her calls all afternoon." The comment made me smile despite everything, because it was so quintessentially my mother to respect my independence while simultaneously finding workarounds to communicate what she needed to say. And I promised Richard I'd call her before the evening was over to let her know I was okay, and to discuss everything that had happened with the benefit of emotional distance and perspective. After we disconnected, I sat on that park bench for a long time, Watching pigeons jung for breadcrumbs, some tourist was scattering. Watching joggers navigate the winding paths. Watching the city continue its relentless forward motion, completely indifferent to individual dramas and triumphs.